All right, we're going to take a real quick look at some tools needed to be effective when you're soldering. If you're working on this from home or if you're not coming to the Saturday workshops, you're going to need a soldering iron. And I'd recommend a soldering iron like you might pick up at Fleet Farm or True Value Hardware. And it looks like this. It's I believe it's a 30 watt, 25 watt, or 30 watt Weller soldering iron, soldering pencil, sometimes they'll call it. It's inexpensive, should be under 10 bucks, and you might even get some solder and so forth with it. So look for a soldering iron that looks like this. Do not look for a soldering iron that looks like this. Because it's just plain too big. The soldering we're doing is real fine and small, so that's called a soldering gun, what we see there. You don't want to use a soldering gun. It's just too big, and you're going to wind up ruining your printed circuit board. There's also something called a soldering station. These are nice. You can control the amount of heat that gets out to the tip of the soldering iron. They are more expensive. If you're real serious about soldering, I've got one of these. If you're real serious about it, go ahead and pick up one of these if you plan on doing a whole lot of soldering. They work really well, a soldering station, but you're going to wind up spending $100 or something like that. You're also going to need some solder. I recommend some real fine solder, rosin core type solder. And there's different alloy mixes in the solder, and the alloy mix I would recommend is called 60-40. 60% lead, 40% tin. That works pretty well with electronics. But get the skinniest solder that you can find. And as far as in town here in Fond du Lac, Kits and File True Value's got some real nice fine solder. And also, if you want some solder, go ahead and stop down at my sign shop, and I'll fix you up with enough to do your board as well. So those are some of the tools you're going to need. You're going to need a soldering pencil, not a soldering iron. You need solder. And you also, it really helps to have a stand for your soldering iron. You've got a place where you can solder where, it's not going to matter if you set down your soldering iron and maybe burn something. Well, that's okay, but a stand is nice, and you can see on the stand here, that yellow area, that's a sponge. And we use that sponge to clean the tip of the soldering iron when it gets dirty. And you're going to notice as you're soldering that the tip of your soldering iron gets black stuff on it. It just gets dirty. And it really makes for nicer solders if you keep the tip clean. So you use that sponge. You get the sponge wet. Use that sponge to clean your soldering iron. You also need something to hold on to your printed circuit board. It's very frustrating to try to solder your printed circuit board. It's small and it's lightweight, and if you try soldering that without something holding it for you, you're going to be frustrated and you're not going to have as nice of a job in the end. So get something that holds your printed circuit board. You can use a small vise. The device shown here is called a helping hand, and that's even got a magnifying glass on it so you can take a really good close look at your solders. And those alligator clips, they'll hold on to your printed circuit board. So at Moraine Park, we've got some of the helping hands, and some of us used vices to hold on to our part. Whatever it is, get something to hold on to it and make it nice and solid. Now, just as important as soldering to and putting solder on our printed circuit board is getting solder off of our printed circuit board. I guarantee you, if you're a beginner, you're going to make some mistakes on your printed circuit board. So you can use something called solder wick. And a solder wick is a braided copper material that when you put it near solder, it literally sucks solder up. So you'll put the solder wick on your mistake. Let's say you've got way too much solder somewhere. Put it on your mistake and then heat up the solder wick right on top of that solder, and it will suck away the solder that is a mistake. Works really nicely. It's called solder wick, and you can find that at Radio Shack if you need some. It's also a device called a solder sucker, and all that is really is a little vacuum cleaner that's going to suck up some solder. So with a solder sucker, you heat up your mistake, get it nice and hot, and it'll become molten, and then you activate the solder sucker, and it will suck the solder in. And the solder sucker is is built as such where the hot solder does not affect it. So real important to have some desoldering tools available to you as well. Now, it's really tempting when you're soldering to put the soldering iron down and just go ahead and touch the solder to the soldering iron and your solder melts. Well, that doesn't work very well as far as getting a good connection. What we want to do is we want to heat up the part. And if you look at the picture down below here, you can see our soldering iron is on one side of the part, and our solder comes in, feeds in from the other side of the part that is sticking through the printed circuit board. So what we do is we heat up the part. Don't even get the solder near your part until you feel like it's hot enough. Okay, so don't let the soldering iron melt the solder. Heat up the part, and then as soon as the part is hot enough, it will melt the solder. And that's going to form a really good connection and a strong bond for you. So that's the most effective way to solder. Make sure you take a look at the video on Moodle. It specifically shows you how to solder the printed circuit board for the robot.